The morning Myrtle Bailey walked into the sheriff's office in Harlow Creek, Colorado. The sky outside was the color of a bruise, and she carried nothing with her but a worn leather satchel, a story that had kept her awake for 3 years straight, and enough courage to fill a canyon she wasn't sure she had earned. The town of Harlow Creek sat at the eastern foot of the Rocky Mountains in the autumn of 1882, a place that had grown up fast around silver and cattle, and the railroad spur that connected it to the wider world. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody else's business, where the barber also served as the dentist, where the saloon did more business before noon than most establishments did in a week, and where a new sheriff had arrived just 6 weeks prior with a reputation for being fair, hard to rattle, and almost impossible to bribe. That sheriff was Clarence Langston, 31 years old, a man who had ridden with the Colorado Rangers for 4 years before accepting the badge at Harlow Creek. He was tall without being imposing, broad-shouldered without being brutish, and he had eyes the particular shade of amber that made people think of autumn leaves just before they fell. He was not the kind of man who talked much, but when he did, people listened. He had come to Harlow Creek with 2 horses, 1 rifle, 1 pistol, a bedroll, and a box of books that the deputy, a young man named Foster Webb, had mocked quietly and then later borrowed without asking. Clarence was sitting at his desk that Tuesday morning in October, reading through a stack of warrants that had been left over from the previous sheriff, a man named Dobbins who had apparently issued them with the enthusiasm of a man handing out candy at a fair. Some of them were sensible, some of them were not. He had already torn up 4 that morning that struck him as dubious at best and malicious at worst, and he was on his 5th cup of coffee, which Foster had made thick enough to stand a spoon in. The door opened. The bell above it rang once, sharp and clear, the way it always did. Clarence looked up. She came in the way people come in when they have spent a long time deciding whether to come in at all. Her steps were deliberate, not hesitant, but you could see the deliberateness in them, the way each foot was placed carefully, as if the floor might give way beneath her. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pinned up under a blue calico bonnet that had seen better days, a dress of the same fabric that was clean but faded, and boots that were scuffed and trail-worn. She was not tall, but she held herself in a way that made you think of people who were. Her face was one of those faces that made you want to look twice, not because it was beautiful in any conventional theatrical way, though it was striking, but because there was something in the arrangement of it, in the set of the jaw and the directness of the dark brown eyes, that suggested a person who had been through things and had come out the other side knowing exactly who she was. She stopped in front of his desk. She looked at him without flinching. "Are you Sheriff Langston?" she asked. "I am," he said. "I am Myrtle Bailey," she said, "and I believe there is a warrant out for my arrest." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back down at the stack of papers on his desk, which was considerable. "You want to sit down?" he asked. She looked at the chair across from him, a plain wooden chair with a split in the back that Foster kept meaning to fix. She sat down. She set her satchel on the floor beside her feet with the particular care of a person who had something in it that mattered to them. "Bailey," he said, and he began to look through the papers. He was not a man who moved quickly without reason, and she watched him rifle through the stack with the patient thoroughness of someone who had learned the hard way what it cost to miss something. He found it about 2/3 of the way down. He pulled it free and read it without expression. The warrant had been issued 8 months ago out of a town called Ridgeton, 40 miles south, signed by a justice of the peace named Harlan Pruitt. It cited Myrtle Bailey, age 26, brown hair, brown eyes, resident of Ridgeton, as wanted for the theft of $800 from the estate of one Gerald Mosswood, deceased, in the period following his death in February of that year. Clarence read it twice. Then he set it on the desk between them and looked at her. "You came to turn yourself in," he said. "I did," she said. "Most people in your position do not do that." "I know," she said, But I have been running for 8 months and I am very tired, and I would rather face it than keep looking over my shoulder every time a door opens." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under him in the way of all chairs in all Western offices that had been through several different occupants. He looked at the warrant again. Then he looked at her. "Before I do anything else," he said, "I want to hear your side of it." She blinked at him. Not with surprise exactly, but with the particular expression of a person who had braced for something and found the floor did not give way after all. "You want to hear my side of it," she repeated. "I do," he said. "Most lawmen don't ask that question when someone comes in on a warrant for theft," she said carefully. "Most lawmen didn't grow up watching their mother get locked up for something she didn't do," he said. And there was no self-pity in it, just a flat statement of fact, the way a man might say most men don't know what winter in the mountains is like unless they've been through it. He stood and walked to the wood stove in the corner and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that sat on it, thick and dark and smelling of something that had been heated too long but was still coffee. He set one in front of her and sat back down. "Tell me what happened," he said. "From the beginning, take your time." She looked at the coffee. She wrapped her hands around the tin mug, and she told him. Gerald Mosswood had been the wealthiest man in Ridgeton, a fact he made sure no one ever forgot. He owned the general store, 2 of the 3 saloons, a good portion of the farmland on the eastern side of town, and the mortgage on a number of homes, including the one that Myrtle had shared with her younger brother Thomas, who was 23, and had a bad leg from a fall he had taken from a horse 3 years prior. Their parents had died when Myrtle was 19, Thomas 17, a fever that had taken both of them in the same week in January, the kind of swift, brutal thing that the frontier did with a regularity that never became less devastating for how common it was. Myrtle had worked as a seamstress and a laundress, and Thomas had worked at the livery when his leg allowed, and they had managed, the way people manage things they were never quite prepared for. The mortgage on the house had been something their father had negotiated with Mosswood years before, and it was not unreasonable on its face, but Mosswood had a habit of adjusting things in his favor whenever circumstances allowed, and after their father's death, he had adjusted the terms twice in 4 years, both times in directions that made the payments harder. In November of 1881, Thomas had met a girl named Clara Whitfield, the daughter of a farmer 3 miles out of town, and by January of 1882, it was clear to everyone who watched them together that they intended to marry. Myrtle had been glad of it, genuinely glad, because Thomas had spent too many years being serious and careful and working around his bad leg, and Clara made him laugh in the particular open way that meant something real. In February, Gerald Mosswood had come to Myrtle. He had come to her not to the house but to the dress shop where she worked for Mrs. Elkins, on a Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Elkins was out. He had made her an offer that was not really an offer in any honest sense of the word. He was 61 years old and a widower, and he wanted to marry her. He explained that if she agreed, the mortgage on the house would be forgiven, that Thomas would have a steady position at the general store, that she would have comforts and security, and a future that sewing other women's dresses would never give her. She had told him no. She had been as clear and firm about it as she could manage, because she had heard the stories about Mosswood, about the way he treated people who owed him things, about the widow Hester who had ended up losing her farm when she could not make a payment 2 years running after her husband died, about the Patton brothers who had borrowed money for seed and had been paying it back for 6 years, and somehow the debt never seemed to get smaller. Mosswood had left the dress shop without another word. 3 days later, Gerald Mosswood was found dead at the bottom of the stairs in his own house, apparently having fallen in the night. He was 61 and had a bad knee, and it was not entirely impossible that he had simply fallen. The doctor, a man named Birch, said as much. There was no obvious injury beyond what a fall would cause. He was buried on a Saturday. The problems began immediately after. Mosswood had a son, Warren, who was 34 and had been living in Denver, and who had always assumed he would inherit everything. Warren came to Ridgeton within a week of the funeral, and with him came a lawyer named Price, who was the kind of man who wore a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, and who looked at everyone else in the room as if they were furniture. It emerged, with great fanfare and some genuine shock, that Mosswood's will, drawn up just 3 weeks before his death, had been changed. The bulk of his estate, including the store, the saloons, and the land, was left to Warren, as expected. But there was a specific clause regarding a personal account held at the Ridgeton Savings and Trust, which contained approximately $800, the proceeds of various personal investments and rental income. That amount, the will stated, was to be given to Myrtle Bailey, formerly of Ridgeton, in recognition of her kindness to a lonely old man. Those were the words in the will, her kindness to a lonely old man. Myrtle had not known about it. She had not been told. When the lawyer Price came to find her and told her what the will said, she had stood in her kitchen with her hands flat on the table and felt a cold dread settle over her that had nothing to do with February weather, because she understood immediately what Warren Mosswood was going to think. She had tried to refuse the money. She had gone to Price and told him she did not want it, that it was a mistake, that Mosswood had put her name in there for reasons she could not explain, but that she had nothing to do with, that she had never given him any reason to believe she had shown him kindness of any particular kind beyond the ordinary polite dealings of people who lived in the same town. Price had looked at her with flat, uninterested eyes and explained that the will was legal and binding, and the money was hers whether she wanted it or not. She had made the mistake of taking it. She had taken it because Thomas's leg had been bad that winter, because they were 2 payments behind on the mortgage, because Clara's father had come down with something that kept him from farming and the Whitfields were struggling, and because $800 was more money than Myrtle had seen in one place in her entire life. She had taken it thinking she could survive whatever Warren Mosswood said about her, that people who knew her would know the truth. She had been wrong about that. Warren Mosswood had gone to Justice of the Peace Harlan Pruitt, who was an old friend of his father's and who had his own reasons for wanting to see Mosswood's estate undisturbed. And within 3 weeks of Myrtle receiving the money, a warrant had been issued for her arrest on the charge of theft from the estate, with the implication being that she had somehow manipulated an old man into changing his will. There had been a deputy who came to the house. He was not unkind, but he had the warrant in his hand and he had instructions, and Myrtle had looked at her brother standing in the doorway of the kitchen, and she had made a decision. She took the satchel that had been packed since the moment Price left her house that first day, because she had always known deep down that something like this was coming. She kissed Thomas on the cheek and told him she would fix it. She walked out the back door while the deputy was still knocking at the front. And she had been running ever since, taking work where she could, moving from town to town, doing laundry and sewing and twice working as a cook at a ranch, saving what she could, sending a little back to Thomas when she could do it safely. She had come to Harlow Creek because she had heard there was a new sheriff, a man who was said to be honest, and she was so tired of running that even the risk of jail felt like a rest. She finished talking. The office was quiet except for the fire in the stove, which popped and settled the way fires do when the wood is still a little green, and the distant sound of a wagon on the main street outside. Clarence had not moved during much of the telling. He had his hands flat on the desk in front of him, and he had watched her face the whole time she spoke, not in the way of a man deciding whether a story holds together, but in the way of a man genuinely listening, which is something different and rarer, and she had felt the difference acutely. He picked up the warrant. He read it again. He thought about it for a moment that felt longer than it was. "This Harlan Pruitt," he said. "He's a justice of the peace down in Ridgeton." "He was Gerald Mosswood's friend for 30 years, she said. "He played cards with him every Friday night up until Gerald got too old to enjoy it. He has reasons to do Warren Mosswood favors." "And the will," Clarence said. "The will was witnessed and filed properly." "It was filed with the county court in Ridgeton," she said. "Price made sure of that immediately. Whatever else Price is, he is thorough." Clarence set the warrant down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her, and in his amber eyes there was something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, and was somewhere between those two things in a territory that did not yet have a name. "You took the money," he said, not as an accusation, just as a statement of the facts as they stood. "I did," she said, and she met his eyes when she said it, the way she had been doing from the beginning. "And I am not ashamed of why I took it. My brother needed it, but I did take it, and if you tell me I have to return what's left of it and face the court, I will do that. I have about $450 left. I can account for every cent of what I spent. I kept records." She reached into the satchel and produced a small notebook, the pages dense with neat, careful handwriting, dates and amounts and explanations. She put it on the desk in front of him. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the warrant. He looked at her. He picked up the warrant. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of paper and ink that could change a person's life in the most ordinary way. The way official things did their damage not with drama but with the simple authority of what was written on them. He tore it in half. Then he tore it in half again. He put the pieces in the wood stove and they caught immediately, curling brown and black and gone. Myrtle stared at the stove. She looked at him. "That warrant," she said slowly, "was an official document issued by a court." "It was issued by a man with a personal interest in the outcome," he said. "And the charge doesn't hold together. You didn't steal anything. You received an inheritance from a man who chose to give it to you through a legal will that has not been contested in any court above the county level. The fact that his son doesn't like it doesn't make it theft." He leaned forward. "What I'm going to do is write to the county court in Ridgeton and request a copy of that will and the record of the original warrant filing. I'm going to do that today. And if what you've told me is accurate, which I believe it is, then that warrant was issued improperly and I can have it voided through the proper channels." He paused. "But I needed to tear that one up first because I wasn't going to sit here with a piece of paper that said I could lock you up while I did the right thing about it." She looked at him. There was a silence that was different from the earlier silences, softer at the edges, like light at the end of the day instead of in the middle of it. "Why do you believe me?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than it had been through the whole account, as if the question came from somewhere more private. He considered that. "Because your account is too detailed to be manufactured, and too honest to be flattering," he said. "You told me you took the money when you could have said you didn't. Most people who are lying clean up the parts that don't look good. You left those in." She nodded once slowly. Then she picked up her coffee cup, which had gone cool, and she drank it anyway. "You should stay in Harlow Creek while I sort this out," he said. "I'd rather have you where I can reach you if I need information. Is that acceptable to you? I have about $12 to my name besides the $450 I'm keeping separate," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge at the boarding house takes in working women," he said. "She'll work with you on the payment. She's a fair woman. And if you can sew, there's a shop on the main street, Mrs. Connolly's, that lost her seamstress to a husband in Pueblo last month. I can put in a word if you want it." She looked at him with that expression again, the one that was not quite surprised but was in the neighborhood. "You would do that," she said. It was not a question, but there was a question in it. "You need a place to be while this gets sorted," he said. "That's a practical matter." "Sheriff Langston," she said carefully. "I walked in here expecting to be put in a cell." "I know," he said. "But you're not going to be, unless you've left something significant out of your account." "I have not left anything out," she said. "Then we're settled," he said. He stood, which brought him to his full height, and he extended his hand across the desk. She looked at it, and then she took it, and they shook the way two people shake when they have agreed to something that is more than it looks on the surface. She left the sheriff's office 20 minutes later with directions to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, and the name of Mrs. Connolly's dress shop written on a piece of paper in Clarence Langston's careful, even hand. She stood on the boardwalk outside and breathed the cool October air of Harlow Creek, which smelled of pine and horses and wood smoke, and felt for the first time in 8 months that the ground beneath her feet was more solid than temporary. Inside, Clarence sat back down at his desk and looked at the place where the warrant had been, and then at the stove where it was now ash. He picked up his pen and began to compose a letter to the county court in Ridgeton, Colorado. Foster Webb came back from his rounds an hour later, shook off his coat, and poured himself coffee. He looked at the sheriff, who was writing with particular concentration. "Anything happen while I was out?" Foster asked. He was 22, with red hair and a face that was all freckles, earnest in the way that young deputies in small towns are earnest, eager to do the right thing and still working out what the right thing was in most situations. "A woman came in," Clarence said without looking up from the letter. "I need you to find out where the circuit judge is riding and when he'll be through Harlow Creek next." "What woman?" Foster said. "A woman with a bad warrant on her," Clarence said. "I tore it up." Foster stared at him. "You tore up a warrant?" "An improperly issued one," Clarence said. "Go find out about the circuit judge." Foster went to find out about the circuit judge. Myrtle found Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house without trouble. It was a 2-story frame house on the quieter end of Harlow Creek's Main Street, painted white, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and a sign that said "Clean Rooms, Fair Rates, Respectable Persons Only," the last part underlined twice with clear intention. Eleanor Aldridge was a woman of about 55 with iron-gray hair, an apron that was always clean even when she was in the middle of cooking, and the manner of someone who had raised 6 children and was therefore impossible to rattle. Myrtle stood on the porch and explained her situation as honestly as she had explained it to Clarence, which is to say fully and without embellishment. She said the sheriff knew where she was and could vouch for her character to the extent a man who had known her for 2 hours could vouch for anything. She said she expected to be working at Mrs. Connolly's dress shop and would pay her rent in full as soon as she had it. Eleanor Aldridge looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I charged my last seamstress boarder $2 a week with Sunday dinner included. Same terms for you. Come in. There's soup on." The room was small and clean, with a window that faced the back garden and a quilt on the bed that someone had made with great care and skill, the kind of quilt that represented months of evenings and meant something about the person who made it. Myrtle sat on the edge of the bed and felt, for the first time, something that might cautiously be called relief. She went to Mrs. Connolly's that same afternoon. Margaret Connolly was a brisk, practical woman of 40, who had run the dress and alterations shop for 12 years, and who was in the middle of a backlog of alterations that she was handling alone and with increasing frustration. She looked at Myrtle's hands, had her hem a piece of fabric, and hired her on the spot. 6 days a week, half-day Saturday, she said. $4 a week to start. "That's fair," Myrtle said. "It's more than fair, it's generous," Margaret said, "and you'll earn it. I've got a backlog 3 weeks deep and the Morrison wedding is in 6 weeks. Myrtle worked that afternoon until the light failed. She walked back to Mrs. Aldridge's in the early dark, eating her supper at the long kitchen table with 3 other boarders. A schoolteacher named Miss Pratt, who was 28 and quiet and kind. A traveling salesman named Hutchins, who talked about himself more than was interesting but was harmless enough. And an elderly widow named Mrs. Tanner, who had come to Harlow Creek to live near her son, and who reminded Myrtle painfully of her mother in the particular way. She passed the bread without being asked. She slept that night for the first time in 8 months, without waking at every sound. The morning was bright and cold, the sky scrubbed clean by the wind that came down off the mountains before dawn, and Myrtle walked to the dress shop through a street that was already busy with the early traffic of a working town, wagons and horses, and the smell of the bakery that opened before anything else did. She passed the sheriff's office and did not look in, and then looked in anyway, and saw through the window that Clarence was at his desk with the same stillness he had had the morning before, reading or writing, coffee on the corner of the desk. He looked up at the exact moment she passed, as if he had been aware of her presence through the glass, and he nodded once. She nodded back and kept walking. Margaret was already at work when she arrived, pinning a length of blue wool with the focused attention of a woman who treated her craft with great seriousness. She handed Myrtle a pile of alterations without preamble, and they worked through the morning in the pleasant, wordless companionship of people who share a skill and a respect for it. At noon, the door of the shop opened and Clarence came in. He was in his coat and hat, the badge catching the gray noon light, and he carried his hat in his hands once he was inside the door, which was a courtesy that Myrtle noticed without meaning to. "Mrs. Bailey," he said. "Miss," she said, and then caught herself saying it and was not sure why she had, because it was simply accurate and nothing beyond that, but Margaret glanced up from her work with a neutrality that was slightly too deliberate. "Miss Bailey," he said, and there was the smallest adjustment in his expression, so small it barely counted. "I heard back from the circuit judge. He'll be through on the 14th. I'd like you to come to the office tomorrow morning if you have time to go over the correspondence I've received from Ridgeton." "I can come before the shop opens," she said. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock is fine," he said. He put his hat back on. "Thank you for your time." He looked briefly at Margaret. "Mrs. Connolly," he left. Margaret waited precisely 4 seconds. "That's the new sheriff," she said. "I know," Myrtle said, and bent her head back to her stitching. "He came all the way over here at noon to tell you about a letter," Margaret said. "He could have sent his deputy," Myrtle said. "Yes," said Margaret, "he could have." They did not discuss it further, but the subject sat in the room between them for the rest of the afternoon with a comfortable kind of presence, like a fire in a stove that nobody mentions because it is warm and doing its job. Myrtle arrived at the sheriff's office at 8 the following morning to find Clarence already there with a letter on the desk in front of him and 2 cups of coffee, which she had not asked for, but which she accepted without comment because she was a woman who could recognize a gesture and had the good sense not to refuse it. He had heard back from Ridgeton. The county court had sent a copy of the will, which confirmed exactly what Myrtle had said. Gerald Mosswood had changed his will 3 weeks before his death, with 2 witnesses and proper legal filing. The clause regarding the $800 was clear and unambiguous. The will had been contested by Warren Mosswood through his lawyer Price, but the contest had been filed at the county level only and had not proceeded to the district court, which meant it had no legal standing yet. "He filed the warrant through Prout before he went through proper legal channels," Clarence said, "which suggests he was more interested in discrediting you than in actually recovering the money through the courts. Because if he could have me arrested for theft, then the story of his father's affection for me becomes taint instead of fact," Myrtle said. Clarence looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said. "I had a lot of time to think about it while I was riding from town to town," she said. "You rode. You had a horse." "I sold it in Grand Junction 2 months ago," she said, "when the money started getting low." There was no self-pity in it, just fact, the same way he had spoken of his mother the first day. He looked at her for a moment with those amber eyes, and she found herself holding still under the look in the way you hold still when something is happening that you do not want to disturb. "I'm going to send to the district court for a formal review," he said. "And when the circuit judge comes through, I want him to see the full record. If this goes the way I think it should, the warrant gets voided officially, and you're free to go where you like." "Free to go where I like," she repeated, and something in her voice was not quite what she expected it to be, not the pure relief she had anticipated, but something more complicated, something that had to do with the fact that going where she liked would take her away from this office, and these 2 cups of coffee, and this man with the amber eyes who had torn up a piece of paper as if it were nothing because it was the right thing to do. She drank her coffee. They talked about the will for another 20 minutes, going over the dates and the details with the thoroughness of people building something that needs to be sound. When she stood to leave, he stood as well, which was a habit of courtesy that was neither performative nor self-conscious in him, just a natural thing. "Miss Bailey," he said, when she was at the door. She turned. He had his hands at his sides and he was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at things when he was trying to be precise. "I am glad you came in," he said, "and not only because I could help with the legal matter." She looked at him. "Thank you for saying that," she said, and she meant it, and he could see that she meant it. And then she walked out into the bright, cool morning of Harlow Creek, and the door closed with the small bell above it, sharp and clear. The days that followed had a particular quality to them. Myrtle worked at the dress shop from early morning until late afternoon, discovering in the work a deep familiar satisfaction that she had had to set aside during the months of moving and surviving. Margaret was rigorous and professional and occasionally funny in a dry, understated way, and the two women fell into the rhythm of people who work well together with the ease that comes when the work itself is honest, and both parties know what they are doing. She fell into the habits of Harlow Creek, the way water finds the low places in terrain. She learned which boarders at Mrs. Aldridge's table liked to talk in the morning, and which ones needed silence with their coffee. She learned that the baker, a man named Sorensen, made a particular cinnamon roll on Thursdays that was worth the 3 cents he charged for it. She learned that the livery owner, a gruff man named Pike, had a soft spot for horses that he expressed in meticulous grooming and careful feeding, and that his enormous black gelding, Silas, would let you scratch his forehead if you approached from the left side and stood still for a moment first. She also fell into the habit of passing the sheriff's office. This was partly pragmatic and partly not, and she was honest enough with herself to know which part was which. Clarence had taken to coming to the dress shop every few days with updates on the legal correspondence, which was progressing steadily. He always took his hat off when he came in. He always addressed her as Miss Bailey in the exact tone of a man who is being careful but cannot entirely control the warmth in his voice. He sometimes stayed 10 minutes beyond the time when the last piece of relevant information had been conveyed, and during those extra minutes they talked about other things, about the town, about books, about the way the mountains looked in the afternoon light when the clouds came in low. He had been born in a small town in Kansas, he told her, the second of 4 children. His father had been a farmer who later became a deputy marshal, a man he described with economy and affection as thorough and fair, which she recognized as the highest praise he knew how to give. His mother had been, as he had mentioned on that first morning, a woman who had been wrongfully accused, a story he told her one afternoon when they were walking along the creek that ran at the edge of town, because he had asked her if she wanted to walk, and she had said yes without thinking about it. His mother had been accused of stealing medicines from the general store in their Kansas town when he was 12, charged by a shopkeeper who had never liked her, and who had, Clarence believed, been covering for an actual theft by someone he wanted to protect. She had spent 3 weeks in the county jail before a traveling judge had reviewed the case and released her. But those 3 weeks had altered something in the family that never quite healed, not because his mother was broken by it, but because Clarence had seen the thing clearly at 12 years old. The way official power, put in wrong hands, could simply destroy a person, and the way the law was only as good as the people using it. "That's why you became a lawman," Myrtle said. They were walking along the creek bank, which was gold and russet with the fallen cottonwood leaves, the water running low and clear over flat stones. "That's why I try to do it the way I think it should be done," he said. "Whether I always manage it is a different question." "You tore up a warrant for a woman you'd known for 10 minutes, she said. "I tore up a warrant that was issued wrongfully," he said. "The timing was coincidental." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the water. "It was not coincidental," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I suppose it wasn't." They walked a little further without speaking, and the creek made its small continuous sound over the stones, and the mountains stood behind the town in the particular way they stood in late October, blue and enormous and covered with snow above the tree line, and Myrtle thought that she had not felt this way in a very long time. This sensation of being in a place and a moment simultaneously, rather than always living slightly in front of herself, always already planning the next exit. "My brother Thomas," she said. "He was supposed to marry Clara Whitfield in the spring." "Was supposed to," he said. "I don't know if he still is," she said. "I wrote to him twice from a town called Palisade, using a different name in the return address so Mosswood's people couldn't trace me. He wrote back once in the autumn of last year to say he was all right and Clara was well. I haven't heard since." She paused. "I miss him considerably." Clarence said nothing for a moment. Then, "When this is settled, you can go back." "I know," she said. She stopped. She was not a woman who left sentences unfinished, and this was not the kind of sentence she was used to having to finish, the kind that contained more than one thing at once. "I find I am not certain where back is anymore," she said finally. He turned and looked at her then fully, not the sideways careful look he had been using since the first morning, but a direct one, and in it was something that had been building since she walked through his office door with her satchel and her story and her eyes that looked at everything without flinching. "Harlow Creek is not a bad back," he said, very quietly. She held his gaze. "The creek ran over the stones. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods." "No," she said. "It is not a bad back at all." They walked back to town in the early dark, not touching, not close enough to touch, but with a new quality of awareness between them, the way the air changes before a storm, not threatening but charged, full of the particular electricity of things that are moving toward each other. The circuit judge arrived on the 14th of October as expected. His name was Judge Harlan Diaz, a man of 60 with white hair and a punctuality that was almost aggressive, and he came into Harlow Creek on a gray morning with 2 associates, and a docket that Clarence had been corresponding with him about for the preceding week. Myrtle sat in the small room off the main street that served as a temporary court when the judge was in town, at a plain table with Clarence beside her, and she told her story again to a man who listened with the focused neutrality of someone who had heard a great many stories, and had learned that the truth and the lie were distinguished mostly by the details people were not careful enough to manufacture. The judge reviewed the copy of the will, the correspondence from the county court in Ridgeton, Myrtle's notebook with its careful accounting of every cent spent, and the original warrant application filed by Harlan Pruitt. He asked several questions, all of them sharp and specific, and Myrtle answered all of them with the directness and precision that had characterized her account from the beginning. The judge looked at the warrant application for a long time. "Justice Pruitt issued this warrant within 18 days of the will being filed," he said. "Yes, sir," Clarence said. "Without waiting for any contest to be adjudicated at the district level," the judge said. "That is correct," Clarence said. "And the basis for the theft charge is the receipt of money left in a properly witnessed and filed will," the judge said, and his voice had taken on a quality that was not quite dry and not quite angry, but was somewhere in the vicinity of a man who has eaten something bad and is trying not to show it. "Yes, sir," Clarence said. The judge signed the voiding of the warrant. He signed it with the particular firmness of a man who means what he is writing. He looked up at Myrtle. "Miss Bailey, you are not a criminal. You received an inheritance from a man who chose to leave you one, and the attempt to characterize it as theft is, in this court's opinion, a misuse of the warrant process that reflects poorly on the issuing justice and on the parties who motivated him." He paused. "I will be sending a letter to the Colorado Attorney General's office regarding Justice Pruitt." Myrtle let out a long breath that she had been holding for rather longer than the last few minutes. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "Thank your sheriff," Judge Diaz said, and looked at Clarence with something that was not entirely without approval. He did his homework. Outside afterward in the cold gray afternoon, Myrtle stood on the boardwalk and looked up at the mountains for a moment without speaking. Clarence stood beside her. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. She turned and looked at him. "You did not have to do any of this," she said. "You could have simply locked me up and let the process go as it was going." "I could have," he said. "But you did not," she said. "No," he said. He looked at her. The badge was on his coat, and the afternoon light was gray and flat, and it caught the lines of his face in a way that made him look both older and younger at once, the way people sometimes look when they are being completely honest. I did not because it was wrong and because I believed you and because, he stopped, and he was not usually a man who stopped mid-sentence, because I found myself wanting to, he said. Very much. There was the moment between them that had been building since the creek walk, since the first morning, since she had walked in with her satchel and her story, and he had asked her to sit down and tell him everything from the beginning. Clarence, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both heard it in exactly the way that a first given name sounds when it has been waiting for that particular mouth to say it. Myrtle, he said, with the same quality, the same first-time sound. They stood on the boardwalk in the cold afternoon of Harlow Creek, Colorado, in October of 1882, with the mountains behind the town and the smell of wood smoke in the air and the sound of the town continuing around them in the indifferent way that towns continue, and he said, "Would you have supper with me tonight? Not as a matter of the legal case, just as supper." "Yes," she said simply, the same way she had said yes to walking along the creek, without thinking about it because there was nothing to think about, because the answer had been there before the question. He took her to supper at the hotel dining room, which was the best eating establishment in Harlow Creek, a room with white tablecloths and actual candles on the tables, and a menu that Mrs. Holt, the proprietress, wrote out fresh every day on a chalkboard, and which that evening included a beef stew that smelled extraordinary. Foster Webb saw them through the window from outside and had a very visible moment of trying to decide whether to wave, then decided against it with the wisdom of a young deputy who understood some things even if he was still learning others. They talked for 3 hours over supper, the way people talk when they have been approaching the real conversation carefully and are now finally in it. She told him about her mother, who had been a remarkable woman, a woman who had learned to read at a time when that was not expected of girls in the place where she grew up, who had taught both her children early and with great enthusiasm, who had died believing absolutely that both of them were going to be fine. He told her about his father, who had in his later years become the kind of lawman Clarence was trying to be, a man who had made enough mistakes in his younger years to understand the cost of them, who had told Clarence the summer before he died that the law was a tool, and like any tool its virtue depended entirely on the hand that held it. They talked about books. She had read more than he expected, and he had read more than he let on in general company, and they had an animated disagreement about a particular novel she had read, and he had not, and which he refused to accept he would enjoy, which she said was exactly the kind of stubbornness that prevented a man from learning things, and he laughed at that, a full genuine laugh, and the sound of it made her feel warm in the way that certain kinds of laughter do. The laughter of someone who does not do it carelessly. When they walked back through the town in the cold, clear night, the stars above Harlow Creek were the extraordinary stars of the high Colorado Plateau, vast and dense and brilliant, the kind of sky that makes the earth feel small and important at the same time. He walked her to Mrs. Aldridge's porch and took his hat off when he said good night, and she stood on the porch step above him, which made them almost exactly the same height, and looked at him in the starlight. "Thank you," she said, meaning far more than supper. "Thank you," he said, meaning exactly the same range of things. She went inside. He stood on the dark street for a moment before walking back, and the stars burned above Harlow Creek in the unconcerned way they always did. The weeks that followed were, for Myrtle, something she had not expected to be finding in Harlow Creek when she walked into the sheriff's office on that October morning with her worn satchel and her 8 months of running. They were weeks of a kind of happiness that arrived quietly rather than dramatically, the way good light enters a room through east-facing windows in the morning, gradual and golden, and so consistent you begin to count on it. She worked at the dress shop, and she was good at it, better than Margaret had expected, which she could tell by the way Margaret gradually began consulting her on design choices rather than just assigning the alteration work. The Morrison wedding was a triumph, a silk and wool ensemble that the bride wept over with joy, and Myrtle's contribution to it was substantial enough that Margaret raised her wages to $5 a week in November and added, as if the information were incidental, that she had been thinking about taking on a partner. She walked along the creek with Clarence 2 or 3 times a week, or they sat in the evenings on Mrs. Aldridge's porch when the weather permitted, which in Colorado in October and November meant a narrowing window but an unimprovably clear one, and they talked with the ease and depth of people who have found in each other something they had not known they were looking for. He was not demonstrative by nature in the conventional sense, not a man given to flowery declarations, but he was steady in a way she had not encountered before in anyone except her mother, a steadiness that was not inertia but was the opposite of it, the stability of something that has been tested and has not moved. He had been watching her, she understood, from the beginning. Not in the way of a man cataloging a woman's attractions, but in the way of a man who has learned to be careful about what he lets himself want, who had been watching to see if the thing he felt on that first morning was the real kind or the misleading kind. She understood this because she was doing the same thing. In November, she wrote a long letter to Thomas. A full letter, not hidden behind a false name, because she was no longer running from anything, and she told him where she was and what had happened, and that the warrant was voided and she was safe. And she told him about Harlow Creek and about the dress shop and about Mrs. Aldridge's quilts and Sorenson's Thursday cinnamon rolls. And at the end of the letter, in the slightly more careful handwriting of someone being precise about something important, she mentioned the sheriff. Thomas wrote back within 2 weeks, a letter that arrived on a cold Thursday morning and which Myrtle read on Mrs. Aldridge's porch wrapped in her coat, and it contained several things. It contained the information that he and Clara had indeed married in May, a small quiet wedding at the Whitfield farm, and that Clara was expecting their first child in March. It contained the information that Warren Mosswood, deprived of the warrant as a weapon, had attempted to take the will contest to the district court and had been denied, and that the house mortgage was now in Thomas's name as it should have been from the beginning, because the old Mosswood papers had been found to be irregularly drawn and a new justice, one without 30 years of Friday night card games behind him, had declined to enforce them. It contained, at the end, a paragraph that said, "I can hear it in how you write about the sheriff, Myrtle. You always were the worst liar in the family. Tell me about him properly next time." She sat on the porch and felt something in her chest that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, but was the particular feeling of relief that arrives when the last thread of something difficult finally resolves. She showed the letter to Clarence that afternoon, or rather, she showed him the relevant parts. He read about Thomas and Clara and the child coming in March with the focused attention he gave everything, and he said, "You should write and tell him to bring his family to visit when the baby is old enough to travel." She looked at him. "That would be," she said carefully, "a significant statement about your expectations regarding my continued presence in Harlow Creek." At her eyes, "Yes," he said, "it would." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "Then I will write that," she said. He reached across the small table between them in the afternoon light of the sheriff's office and put his hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her except for handshakes, and the warmth of it went from his palm through the back of her hand and seemed to settle in the middle of her chest. "I am not a man who says things easily," he said. "You've probably noticed that." "I have noticed that," she said. "But I think you know what I mean," he said. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. He turned her hand over and held it properly, his thumb along the inside of her wrist, and she could feel her own pulse there and suspected he could too. "There isn't a formal way to do this in a sheriff's office," he said. "There is not," she agreed. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with your permission, and at whatever pace is right for you." She looked at him in the afternoon light. This man who had torn up a warrant on the basis of 10 minutes of conversation and a feeling about the quality of someone's honesty, who had sat across desks and walked along creeks and sat on cold porches looking at the mountains, who had read her letters from Ridgeton with the attention he gave everything, who had taken his hat off every time he walked into a room where she was. "You have my permission," she said. "And you have been courting me for 6 weeks already, Clarence Langston, whether you knew it or not." He smiled then, fully, the kind of smile that changed his whole face, and she thought that it was a face she wanted to see that smile on for a very long time. The courtship, having been thus formally acknowledged, proceeded with the particular happiness of two people who have been in the long, careful part of falling in love, and have finally given themselves permission to be in the part that comes after. They went to supper at the hotel dining room regularly enough that Mrs. Holt began to note their usual table. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons, Clarence on his tall bay horse and Myrtle on a steady roan mare that Pike at the livery rented to her at what she suspected was a rate significantly below market, because Pike approved of the sheriff and had his own version of community feeling. The mountains in November were spectacular in the way that only someone who has spent time with mountains can fully appreciate. The snow line coming lower every week, the air getting thinner and colder, the light changing its angle and quality to something lower and more golden that made every ordinary thing, the fence posts, the dry grass, the bare cottonwoods along the creek, look like it had been carefully arranged. They rode along the base of the foothills one Sunday afternoon in early December, and Clarence pointed out a red-tailed hawk riding the thermals above a ridge, and she watched it with her chin tipped up and her hair coming loose from its pins in the wind, and he watched her watching it with an expression on his face that Foster Webb, who happened to ride past them on his own errand and took in the scene at a glance, described later to his wife, who he had in a distant city in a series of letters he was composing with great care, as the expression of a man who has found something he did not know he was looking for and intends to keep it. In December, Clarence asked her to marry him. He did not do it in the sheriff's office, though there would have been a kind of rightness to that given where they had started. He did it on the porch of Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house on a Sunday evening in mid-December, when the stars were out in full force, and the cold was sharp and clean, and the mountains were invisible in the dark, but their presence was absolute, the way the presence of things that are large enough always is. He had his hat in his hands, which she had come to understand was his version of expressing that something mattered to him, the involuntary giving up of the hat, and he spoke to her with the directness and care that he brought to everything, without elaborate speeches or dramatic constructions, just the true thing said clearly. "I love you, Myrtle," he said. "I have been in love with you since somewhere around the first week, and I have spent the time since then making sure I was not mistaken about what that meant, and I am not mistaken. I want to marry you if you'll have me. I want to build a life here with you. I know this is not what you came to Harlow Creek expecting to find. I know you came here just wanting the thing you were running from to stop. But I am asking you to stay, not because you have to, because the warrant is gone and you could go anywhere, but because I am here and I believe we are good together and I would like the rest of my life to include you in it." She had been looking at him through the whole of this, standing on the porch step so their faces were level, close enough to see in the dim light from the boarding house windows that he was steady, not nervous exactly but very attentive, waiting for her answer the way he waited for everything important with his full self. "I love you too," she said. "I loved you before I was ready to know I loved you, which is the worst timing possible, but there it is." She reached out and took the hat from his hands and held it between them. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He took her face in both his hands and kissed her, and it was the first kiss, warm and real and careful in the particular way of a man who means what he is doing, and the stars above Harlow Creek burned on in their brilliant Colorado winter clarity, and from inside the boarding house There was the muffled sound of Alina Aldridge telling someone sharply to mind their business and move away from the window, which suggested that at least some of the residents had been watching, and which made Myrtle laugh against his mouth, and him pull back to look at her with an expression of such clear affection that she kissed him again. They were married on a Saturday in January of 1883 at the small Methodist church at the end of Harlow Creek's Main Street, by a minister named Reverend Doyle, who had a sonorous voice and who managed to make the ceremony feel both formal and warm. The church was not large, but it was full. Alina Aldridge sat in the front row with her iron-gray hair done up particularly nicely and a handkerchief in her hand that she used. Margaret Connolly sat beside her with the satisfied expression of a woman who knows she has had a part in something. Foster Webb stood up with Clarence as his witness, wearing a new coat and managing to keep his expression solemn for approximately the first 5 minutes before breaking into a grin that did not leave his face for the remainder of the ceremony. Miss Pratt from the boarding house came, and Pike from the livery, and Sorensen the baker, and most of the town that had had dealings with them over the preceding 3 months and had been watching the progress of the thing with the benevolent attention that a small town gives to its sheriff's love life when the sheriff in question is the kind of man people are actually glad to see happy. Myrtle wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with blue ribbon at the collar and cuffs, made in the evenings over 3 weeks in December in the back room of the dress shop, while Margaret kept watch against anyone who might report back to Clarence, because she believed, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who knew her own mind, that a bride should make her own dress if she could make a dress at all. She walked up the aisle of the small church and looked at Clarence standing at the front, and he looked at her, and neither of them was the kind of person who cried easily, but she saw him swallow once in a way that told her what the moment cost him to be still for, and she felt exactly the same. They said their vows in the plain, direct language of the ceremony, and when Reverend Doyle said that part about those whom God has joined, Myrtle looked at Clarence and thought about a morning 3 months earlier when she had walked into a sheriff's office, carrying a story she had been carrying alone for 8 months, and about what it meant that the story had brought her here to this, and to him. The reception was at the hotel dining room, where Mrs. Holt had decorated with great enthusiasm and produced a wedding supper of extraordinary quality, and where Foster Webb made a toast that started earnest and ended funny and was exactly the right length. Alina Aldridge hugged Myrtle with the firmness of a woman who considers you family whether or not the paperwork is in order. Margaret Connolly told Clarence privately, in the tone of a woman delivering an important instruction, to take good care of her, and he said he intended to, and Margaret looked at him for a moment, and then nodded once with the finality of a case closed. Clarence had a house on the east side of Harlow Creek, a solid frame house that he had been slowly improving since his arrival, which had meant it was livable but not finished when they married, and which became the pleasant, ongoing project of 2 people who had similar taste in practical comfort, and who disagreed cheerfully about the color of the kitchen walls for approximately 3 months before arriving at a yellow that they both agreed was right. The house had a good kitchen and a sitting room with a fireplace and 2 bedrooms and a porch that faced the mountains, and Myrtle stood on that porch on their wedding evening, in the January dark with the cold air against her face, and looked at the mountains and thought, here, this is where back is. This is the place. She wrote to Thomas in February, a long full letter about the wedding and the house in Harlow Creek in winter, and she included a formal invitation for him and Clara and the baby, whenever the baby arrived and was old enough to come for a visit. She said she wanted Thomas to meet Clarence properly, and she said it in the way that made clear she meant, I want the most important people to know each other. Thomas wrote back in March with the news that Clara had delivered a son on the 18th of the month, 7 pounds and healthy, named William after their father, who had been named William Bailey and had died too soon. Myrtle sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and cried, fully and openly, for the first time since all of it began, because William Bailey had not been there to see any of it, not Thomas's wedding or the baby or Myrtle's own marriage. And grief is not a thing that waits politely until you have space for it. Clarence found her there and pulled up a chair beside her and put his arm around her and let her cry without trying to fix it, which is the correct thing to do and which not everyone knows. Spring came to Harlow Creek with the violence and beauty that the Colorado Rockies expressed every season, the snow melting from the mountains in a roar of melt water in the creek, the cottonwoods coming green, the land waking up in the way that land in high country wakes up, suddenly and completely, as if it had been storing the green for months and could not contain it any longer. The dress shop, now officially Connolly and Bailey as of February, was busy with the spring work, new dresses and alterations, and the particular flurry of activity that came when the better weather made people want better clothes. Clarence was busy with the spring work of a growing town, the disputes and difficulties that multiplied with the warmer weather and the increased traffic, the occasional need to deal with men who came through Harlow Creek with purposes that were not entirely their stated ones, managed always with the thoroughness and fairness that had been his character from the beginning. In April, Clarence came home on a Thursday afternoon and found Myrtle in the kitchen, not working, which was not like her, sitting at the table with her hands in her lap with a particular expression on her face that he could not quite read, and he took his hat off and set it on the hook by the door and said, "What is it?" She looked at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something in the vicinity. "We are going to have a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands and looked at her face with the attention he gave things that were very important to him. "Myrtle," he said. "I believe it is November," she said, "if I have my dates right, which I do." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the thing move through him, the thing that was too large for his habitual economy of expression, and she saw it break through in the way it had only broken through a handful of times in the months she had known him, in the full open quality of his face when the containment gave way. He put his arms around her carefully, the way you put your arms around something precious, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stayed like that in the kitchen with the spring light coming through the window, in the house they had been making into a home. "I am very glad," he said, against her hair. "I am very glad too," she said. Summer came and Myrtle was well through it, continuing to work at the shop until July and then working from home when the baby was close, doing the fine alterations work that could be managed at a table, because she was not a woman who stopped being useful because she was uncomfortable. And Margaret came to her twice a week with work and stayed for tea and conversation of a quality that their friendship had settled into. The kind of deep practical friendship between women that is one of the things that makes difficult places livable. Thomas and Clara came in August, traveling up from Ridgeton on the railroad with little William, who was 5 months old and who looked, with the particular unfairness of babies, exactly like their father, the same dark eyes and the clear, broad forehead that had been William Bailey Sr.'s most recognizable feature. Myrtle held her nephew in the sitting room of the house on the east side of Harlow Creek and felt something settle in her, something that had been subtly off balance since she was 19 years old, and found herself responsible for a 17-year-old with a broken leg and a world that had abruptly gotten much colder. Thomas was well. His leg had improved, Clara had told her in her letters, after a doctor in Ridgeton had recommended a specific treatment that had helped. He walked with only a slight hitch now, and he had the look of a man who has found his life and is glad of it, a particular ease that came through in the way he sat in a chair and talked and laughed. He was 23, taller than Myrtle remembered, though that might have been the standing up straighter. Clara was lovely and warm and sharp in the way of a woman who grew up on a farm and learned early that the world responds to practicality. And within an hour of their arrival, she and Myrtle were talking with the ease of women who were going to be sisters in the real sense. Thomas and Clarence met in the sitting room while the women were in the kitchen, and there was a moment of the particular assessment that men do when the sister's husband meets the brother. And then Thomas said, "She wrote and told me what you did, the warrant and everything. I want you to know what that means to me." And Clarence said, "She made it easy. She came in knowing exactly what she wanted to say." And Thomas said, "That's Myrtle." And Clarence said, "Yes," with a warmth that Thomas apparently found entirely satisfactory, because his assessment concluded at that point in the manner of a man who has received the information he needed. They stayed for 2 weeks, and the house on the east side of Harlow Creek was fuller and livelier than it had ever been, with Thomas and Clara in the spare room and little William in a borrowed cradle, and the sounds and smells of a family in full residence filling every room. There were long suppers around the kitchen table and walks along the creek, and 2 occasions when Thomas and Clarence rode out together, apparently in comfortable silence most of the time, which was apparently the way both of them preferred certain conversations, and returned looking like men who understood each other well enough. The night before they left, Myrtle and Thomas sat on the porch in the evening, the mountains dark against the stars, and talked the way they had not been able to talk for 2 years, the long, honest talk of siblings who know each other from the inside out. "Are you happy?" he said. "Extremely," she said. "Good," he said. "You deserve to be." "I might say the same for you," she said. "Clara makes it easy," he said, with the simplicity of a man who knows his luck and names it honestly. Then he said, "What happened to Mosswood, Warren?" "Do you know?" She did know, as it happened. Price the lawyer had apparently found a more profitable client in Denver and had withdrawn from the will contest before the district court. Without the warrant as a weapon and without Price to manage the legal campaign, Warren Mosswood had eventually settled into running the businesses his father had left him, which were the legitimate ones, and the store and the saloons had continued. There were occasional rumors through the networks of correspondence and hearsay that crossed the territory, and the general understanding was that Warren was not a warm-hearted man but was a functional one, and that without the specific grievance of the inheritance money to drive him, he had let the matter go. Harlan Pruitt had, as Judge Diaz had promised, been the subject of correspondence with the Attorney General's office. The result had been an inquiry and a finding that Pruitt had on several occasions issued warrants with insufficient basis at the request of interested parties. He had been removed from his position the previous spring. "Justice of a kind," Thomas said. "Justice of a kind," Myrtle agreed. Thomas left the next morning with Clara and little William, with the railroad tickets and a basket from Alina Aldridge, who had given it to Myrtle for them, and who had apparently packed it with enough food for a journey 4 times the length of the one they were making. They stood on the platform and embraced with the fullness of people who have been through the same things and know it, and Myrtle held her nephew once more, and he looked at her with the incurious bright gaze of a 5-month-old and grabbed her finger with his entire fist. "We will come for Christmas if we can manage it," Thomas said. "Come for Christmas," Myrtle said. "We will have more room by then." Thomas looked at her. Then he looked at Clarence, who was standing a few feet back with the courtesy of a man who knows when something is a sibling moment. Then he looked back at her and understood what she meant, and the look on his face was the look of a brother who has been worrying about his sister for several years and can at this moment let most of the worry go. The train pulled out. Myrtle stood and watched it go and then turned and found Clarence beside her, and she took his arm and they walked back through Harlow Creek in the warm August morning, through the town that was hers now, past the dress shop and the bakery and the boarding house and the church, and the sheriff's office with its bell above the door. In November, in the house on the east side of Harlow Creek with the mountains visible through the bedroom window, their son was born. He came into the world on a cold, clear night with Doc Hargrove presiding and Alina Aldridge, assisting with the no-nonsense competence of a woman who had ushered 6 of her own into the world, and had opinions about how it should be done. Clarence stayed as close as he was allowed, which was in the kitchen, where Foster Webb had come and sat with him in the specific way of a young man who does not know what to do but knows that being present is the point of it. The baby was healthy and loud in the way of babies who have things to say from the very beginning. He had Clarence's coloring, the amber eyes already showing in the particular unfocused way of newborns, and he had Myrtle's jaw, which Clarence found immediately and completely remarkable. "What will you call him?" Doc Hargrove asked, with the satisfied expression of a man at the conclusion of a good night's work. Myrtle was lying back with the baby in her arms, looking at him with the specific expression of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not know she was traveling to and finds it more than she imagined. She looked at Clarence, who was sitting beside the bed now, close, his hand over hers. "We talked about William," Clarence said. He had asked her about that name weeks ago, carefully, understanding that it belonged to someone before it could belong to them. "William," she said, looking at the baby, who had closed his eyes with the absolute conviction of someone who has done a great deal of work and intends to rest now. "William Thomas Langston." She looked at Clarence. "For my father and my brother," Clarence nodded. There was nothing performative in the nod, just the deep assent of a man who understands the importance of what is being preserved. He put his hand very gently on the baby's head, light as possible, and the baby made a small sound of no particular meaning but absolute significance. Thomas came for Christmas, as promised, with Clara and little William Whitfield Bailey, in a red wool coat that Clara had made, tottering now at 9 months and very interested in the Christmas tree that Clarence and Foster Webb had carried in with great ceremony the week before. The house on the east side of Harlow Creek held everyone in the comfortable close way of a house that is the right size for the life being lived in it, full of the sounds of 2 babies who were small enough to sleep most of the time but awake often enough to make themselves known, and the smell of the cooking that Alina Aldridge had supervised from next door, with the conviction that Christmas dinner required her guidance, and the particular warmth of pine fires and good food, and the people who matter most in one place. On Christmas evening, when both babies had been settled and the supper dishes were done, and Thomas and Clara had gone to bed in the comfortable tiredness of new parents who will take any available quiet hour, Myrtle and Clarence sat in the sitting room by the fireplace with the Christmas tree behind them, and the mountains invisible in the dark outside the window but entirely there, as they always were. She was leaning against him on the settee, their son asleep in the cradle by the fire, and the house was quiet in the particular way of a house full of sleeping people, which is not really silent but is the most comfortable sound there is. "I have been thinking," she said, "about that morning." He was quiet, but she could feel the quality of his attention. "I walked in there thinking I was surrendering," she said. "I had been running for 8 months and I had no more running left in me. I walked in to face whatever was going to happen." She paused. "I did not walk in thinking I was walking in to find the best thing in my life." He made a sound that was very quiet, low in his chest. "It is interesting," she said, "the way the thing you least expect turns out to be the thing you needed most." "You could have walked into any sheriff's office in Colorado," he said, "and you walked into mine." "I walked into yours," she agreed, "because I had heard you were fair." "And I tore up a warrant," he said. "You tore up a warrant," she said, "because you listened." They sat in the firelight of the house they had made together, in the town that had become home in the way that only happens when a place and a time and a person coincide in exactly the right configuration, and outside the winter pressed close against the windows, and the mountains stood in the dark the way they always stood, enormous and unhurried, and full of the particular endurance of things that have been in the same place for longer than human time can measure. William Thomas Langston slept in his cradle with the absolute peace of an infant who does not yet know that the world is complicated, which is one of the great mercies of being new. In the spring that followed, Margaret and Myrtle expanded the dress shop, taking the space next door when it came available, which was a project they pursued with the combined energy of two women who know what they want professionally and have the skills to get it. The expanded shop had room for a cutting table of proper size and two fitting areas, and eventually, a young woman named Alice Strand, fresh from the East and full of technical training in dressmaking, whom they hired in June and who turned out to be precise and hardworking and quietly funny in a way that complemented the established tone of the shop. Harlow Creek grew the way Colorado towns grew in the 1880s, steadily and with the particular vitality of a place that had good water and railroad access, and a surrounding landscape that drew people who were looking for somewhere worth staying. New businesses opened, families arrived, the school added a second classroom, the church was enlarged. A newspaper started up, the Harlow Creek Courier, run by a young man named Abernethy who had an instinct for the story behind the story and who was, Clarence told Myrtle, either going to be a very good journalist or a considerable nuisance, possibly both simultaneously. Clarence was re-elected as sheriff in the spring of 1884, the first election since his original appointment, and he won it by a margin that reflected the general opinion of Harlow Creek's residents, that he was exactly the kind of sheriff a town like theirs needed, which is to say the kind who did the job as if it were a trust rather than a position. Foster Webb was made deputy proper and given a raise that he was embarrassed by and grateful for in equal measure. Myrtle stood in the sheriff's office the afternoon of the election results, the place where it had all begun, and looked at the desk where she had first sat down with her worn satchel and her coffee gone cold and her story. And she thought about the distance between that morning and this afternoon, with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that mattered. Clarence came in from the street, where he had been accepting congratulations with the economical good grace of a man who is not comfortable with fuss, and he stopped when he saw her standing there. "You're looking at the desk," he said. "I'm remembering," she said. He came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the plain wooden desk and the wood stove and the chair with the split in the back that Foster had finally repaired the previous winter, and the window with its view of the main street, ordinary and familiar. "You walked in here," he said, "with about $12 and a warrant on your head and enough courage to fill a room. And you made coffee," she said. "The coffee was Foster's," he said. "I cannot take credit for that," she laughed. He put his arm around her shoulders. "I would not change a single thing about that morning," she said, "not even the terrible coffee." "Foster's coffee improved," he said. "Eventually. Many things improved," she said. He kissed the top of her head, and she leaned into him in the afternoon light of the sheriff's office, and outside on Harlow Creek's main street the spring of 1884 was doing its work, the cottonwoods coming green again, the creek running high with the mountain melt, the town going about its business in the steady, indifferent way of towns that are simply living. By the summer of 1885, little William was walking and running and demonstrating a personality that was equal parts his father's thoroughness and his mother's willingness to look at everything directly, plus a particular reckless happiness that seemed to belong entirely to himself. He had Clarence's amber eyes and Myrtle's dark hair, and he collected rocks with a dedication that had resulted in a substantial pile behind the house that Clarence kept meaning to address and never quite did, because William's pride in it was too complete to disturb without good reason. They had come into the habit of Sunday rides in all weather, the three of them, William on a small spotted pony named Admiral that Clarence had bought from Pike with great deliberation, choosing it the way he chose everything, carefully, and from thorough knowledge. William had been riding since he was old enough to be trusted not to pitch himself off, and he had taken to it with the instinctive ease of someone who had been born in the right place for it, which he had. One Sunday afternoon in October, the three of them rode along the base of the foothills on the trail that Myrtle and Clarence had ridden together for the first time in that autumn of 1882, 3 years past now. The sky was the brilliant blue of Colorado in October, and the aspens above the tree line had gone gold, entire mountainsides of gold, the way they did every year, and which never got ordinary no matter how many times you saw it. William rode Admiral with great seriousness, narrating his observations about the landscape with the thoroughness of a 3-year-old who has been raised by people who pay close attention to things. He noted a hawk. He noted a particular rock that was red and should therefore be added to the collection. He noted that Admiral was tired and needed to rest, which was William's way of saying that William was tired and needed to rest. They stopped at the place by the creek where Myrtle and Clarence had walked that first time, where the cottonwoods made a shelter and the water ran clear over the flat stones. Myrtle lifted William down and he sat on the bank and immediately began constructing something with the creek stones in the systematic way of a child who has inherited a certain methodical quality from both sides. Myrtle sat on the bank beside him. Clarence sat beside her. The horses drank at the creek's edge. The mountains were above them, enormous and golden and blue-white at the peaks, and the creek made its perpetual sound, and Harlow Creek was just visible through the cottonwoods, the smoke from its chimneys rising in the still afternoon air. "Thomas writes that they may be coming in December again," Myrtle said. "Good," Clarence said. "William should see more of his cousin." "Clara is expecting again," she said. "They think March." He looked at her. She was looking at the creek. "We might also have something to tell them when they arrive," she said, in a tone of studied casualness that did not fool him for a single moment. He was very still. Then he said quietly, "Myrtle." She looked at him then sideways, with that expression that was not quite a smile but was everything around a smile, all the warmth and the directness, and the steadiness that he had recognized from the very first morning. "November again, I think," she said. "Possibly December this time." He took her hand, the way he had that afternoon in the sheriff's office when he had turned it over and held it with his thumb along the inside of her wrist. William, without looking up from his construction project, said, "What?" with the particular alertness of a child who knows when the adults are having a significant conversation and has opinions about being excluded from it. "Nothing important," Clarence told him. "Everything important," Myrtle said at the same time and laughed, and Clarence laughed too, and William looked at both of them with the dignified tolerance of a child who suspects adults are strange and is accumulating evidence to support this theory. The baby, when it came, was a girl. She arrived in late November in the same room where William had arrived 2 years before, with Doc Hargrove and Eleanor Aldridge and Clarence in the kitchen again, this time with Thomas there as well, because Thomas and Clara had arrived early for the holidays, and had timed it perfectly or imperfectly depending on how you felt about Thomas spending a long evening in the kitchen with Clarence, which had apparently resulted in a conversation about farming and land, and the nature of things that both men had found satisfying. They named her Frances Edith Langston, after Clarence's mother, who had been a Frances and who had spent 3 weeks in a county jail for something she did not do, and had come out the other side unchanged in the essential way, which was, Clarence said, the most important thing he knew about courage. William took the arrival of Frances with a mixture of deep interest and occasional suspicion. He presented her, on the second day, with a creek stone from the collection, a particularly fine piece of red feldspar that he considered among the best. This was understood by everyone present to constitute an acceptance. The years that followed in Harlow Creek were the years of a life being fully lived, which is not a dramatic thing but is the best kind of thing, rich and particular and daily. The dress shop continued to grow and to be a point of both commerce and community in the way that businesses run by people who care about their work and their neighbors inevitably become. Margaret Connolly, who had always said she had no interest in marrying again after her first husband had died young, surprised everyone including herself by accepting a proposal from Judge Diaz, who had retired from the circuit and settled in Harlow Creek in 1886 with the specific intention of spending his retirement somewhere with mountains and good coffee, and who had been slowly building a friendship with Margaret over several years of his visits to the town that had, it emerged, been something other than simply friendly on both sides for quite some time. Myrtle was Margaret's witness at the wedding, standing beside her in the same small church where she had married Clarence 3 years before, and she thought about the shape of things, how a morning can change everything and send out rings of consequence like a stone in water, not just for the person in the immediate center of it, but for the people adjacent, the judge who had seen a case clearly, and in doing so had set a whole chain of things in motion. Clarence was elected sheriff a second, and then a third time, serving Harlow Creek through the changes of the late 1880s with the consistency that had always been his character. He was not a man who made his mark loudly, but Harlow Creek knew what it had in him, and the knowing was of the steady, certain kind that persists because it is well-founded. He taught William to ride properly, not just to sit on a horse but to ride, with the patience and precision he brought to everything, taking a year over it and treating the process with the seriousness it deserved, because a man who could not ride in the territory of Colorado in the 1880s was a man with a significant limitation. William took to it with the enthusiasm of someone for whom the right activity arrives like a recognition. He was on Admiral every afternoon that weather allowed, an admiral who had seemed elderly from the beginning, but turned out to be merely unhurried, bore this with philosophical acceptance. He also taught William to read, beginning earlier than most people thought necessary and proceeding at William's own pace, which was faster than expected, because William had his mother's particular relationship with information, the instinct that it was for doing something with, not just for having. Frances grew up next to her brother in the way of younger siblings, fierce and observant and deeply unimpressed by his authority over her, which he exercised with the thoroughness of a firstborn, and which she resisted with the strategic creativity of someone who has worked out quickly that the rules are not quite as fixed as the firstborn believes. She had Myrtle's dark hair and Frances Sr.'s name, and a laugh that came from nowhere identifiable, and which made everyone within earshot want to laugh too. She had, by the time she was 4, a friendship with the creek and the rocks along it that was entirely her own, independent of William's collection, conducted with a different set of criteria, and a different kind of attention, more interested in the water itself than in what was in the water, sitting for long periods watching the flow and the eddies with the rapt focus of someone reading something that matters. Myrtle looked at her daughter sitting by the creek on a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1889, the mountains above them gold with the aspens, and she thought about the things that pass through a family like a river, the shape of a face, the color of eyes, the particular quality of attention, the way of being present to things, carried forward in the people who come next. Clarence sat beside her on the bank, as he always sat beside her, close enough to touch, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she had in the sitting room by the fireplace on that Christmas evening years before, easy and certain and full. "I have been thinking," she said. "I noticed," he said. She smiled at the mountains. "About that morning still," she said. "I think about it more often than you might expect." "I think about it often too," he said. "You tore up a piece of paper," she said. "That's all it was in the physical sense, a piece of paper." "It was not all it was," he said. "No," she agreed. "It was not." She paused. "It was someone deciding that a person deserved to be heard, that the story mattered." He was quiet. Frances, at the creek's edge, had found something in the water and was examining it with the total absorption of a 4-year-old in the presence of something interesting. William was somewhere up the bank with Admiral, engaged in some project of his own. "I was afraid," Myrtle said. "That morning, I was so afraid I could feel it in my hands, but I walked in because I had decided I was not going to let the fear make my decisions for me anymore. I had let it make them for 8 months, and all it had got me was more tired and more alone." "You were not alone by the time you left," he said. "No," she said. "I was not, because you listened." She turned and looked at him, The face she knew as well as any face in the world, the amber eyes and the careful mouth and the quality of steadiness that was in every part of him. That is what it was, really. You listened. He looked at her. The mountains were behind him and the creek ran past them, and their daughter was calling to show them something she had found in the water, holding it up in her small hands. "Come and see," Francis was calling. "Come and see." They went and saw. It was a smooth white stone of no particular rarity, exactly the kind of creek stone that lined every creek in Colorado, but Francis held it as if it were the most remarkable thing in the territory, which in the moment it was, because she had found it herself and it was hers. Myrtle took it in her palm and looked at it with the full attention it deserved. "It's perfect," she said. Francis took it back with satisfaction and turned back to the water. Clarence took Myrtle's hand, still curved from holding the stone, and held it the way he had always held it, with his thumb along the inside of her wrist. And they stood by the creek in the autumn of Harlow Creek, Colorado, in the mountains that were older than anything either of them would live to see change. And the water ran over the stones and carried its perpetual small sound forward into all the country ahead of it, patient and clear and continuous as the best things always are.